All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Horgan. I'm the Chief Development Officer here at Pioneer Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the current state of housing. I think we can all agree that the housing situation in Massachusetts is pretty bleak. We have a lot of affordability crises, and as we've seen with the recent Boston University study on outmigration, the largest group that's leaving the state is the 26 to 35-year-olds. Many citing housing affordability as a key issue to that. But what's behind it all, and what are some of the solutions that we can actually implement to address these problems? Today, I'm thrilled that we're joined with our experts, Andrew Mikula and Gary Kerr, who will help us answer some of these questions and provide some insights as well in terms of how we might be able to come up with some solutions. Andrew is a senior fellow here at Pioneer on housing, and his work is focused a lot on urban planning, economic development, and regulatory reform. He has a master's degree in urban planning from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Gary is the Senior Managing Director of Development Services in the Northeast region for Greystar, which is a developer and owner of some $80 billion worth of real estate assets worldwide, including almost 1 million apartment units and student housing beds. Certainly something here in Massachusetts we have a lot of. Gary also led the redevelopment of Boston's iconic Pier 4 and worked on master planning entitlement of over 1 million square feet of commercial space in Kendall Square. Thank you both for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Andrew. And Gary, thank you so much for being here. So I'd like to start by talking about housing at a pretty high level. Affordability in particular is an immense challenge, both in the Boston region and in the nation as a whole. High interest rates and competitive markets have really made it hard for millions of families who would otherwise be in a good position to buy a home to, afford, especially the monthly payments recently. So, and at the same time, the steep price of rent makes it hard to save up to buy a home. So can you share some of your perspectives on the kind of regional and national picture here and how Boston fits in relative to other large metropolitan areas?
Yeah, happy to. The Northeast, and there's a few markets across the country, but the Northeast is one in particular that is not being oversupplied. So we're seeing a lot of other markets around the country where there's significant oversupply of housing. Rents are actually falling. We're really burdened here by historic undersupply. And so we have people, and I personally believe that while Greystar provides rental housing is how do I best put this? Rental housing is just one part of the housing solution. It needs to fully function to allow other aspects of the housing solution to work. And so no one can today leave college and buy a home. So they got to go somewhere in the interim. And for a lot of people, that's renting an apartment from an institutional landlord. Those rents are market driven. And so they're driven by the cost to build, the required return. If you think about who our investors typically are, these are pension funds, these are insurance companies. These are groups that are not looking for outside market returns. They're looking for steady, stable cash flow over time. So we're not trying to charge rents that continually move the needle on the market. We just need to, at the current cost base to develop, provide buildings that meet a minimum market return. And that's really where we spend a lot of our time and our focus. So what we're seeing though across the country is just a dramatic, obviously we've went through an incredible inflationary period. And in that we've seen we just go up to, but we've also seen costs go up. And so rents are just reflective of the incomes and expenses in the market, so as they say. And so we would like to try and help that solution. But part of that is, we can't add new supply for less cost than the cost to build yesterday. So we need that market to balance out. And we're starting to see some of that, but we're not quite there yet. But I think overall across the country, just historic undersupply in a lot of markets has led to, housing prices increase pretty dramatically.
Right. So yeah, let me provide some context around this, idea of kind of low housing availability, as well as poor affordability. So we saw active home listings on the market nationwide fall by more than half between the beginning of 2020 and say that the summer of 2022 or so. Nationwide, that trend has started to reverse, and there's better housing affordability or availability, now than there was during the early days of the COVID lockdowns. But in Greater Boston, in a region of 5 million people, or almost 5 million people, there were last month about 6,000 homes for sale on the market. Historically, at this time of year, that would have been about 10 or 12,000, almost twice as many. So Gary, in your estimation, how much of this low availability is due to the lack of supply? And how much is due to kind of the disincentive to sell your home among homeowners who have locked in a kind of lower mortgage interest rate that you can get today?
It's a combination of two things. You know, I definitely think it's the incentive to sell and move. I think a lot of people are locked in at, you know, mortgage rates that are unprecedentedly low. And they may never want to exit that loan. They want to stay there. Even in scenarios where you then have people who are probably what we call overhoused. You know, you have, you know, maybe one or two people, all the children have gone off to college, 5-6 bedroom house. And just, there's no incentive to downsize that. There's also maybe nowhere for them to go. In a downside scenario. But I do think it's more heavily driven today by a lack of incentive to move. I think a lot of people would like to move, but it's financially unfeasible. They would be, you know, trading in a home for potentially, most people, it's a larger home. Families grow, they want to move to a larger home or a smaller home for a payment that could be 2x what they're currently paying. And it's sort of mathematically infeasible for most people.
Right. So what you're saying in the short term, the issue is the kind of interest rate differential.
The stagnation, yeah, on a short-term basis, yes. I think long-term, people's needs outweigh their sort of financial constraints. And they make these decisions and they are either forced to move or figure out a way to absorb the cost. But in the short term, I think we're still talking, it's very much the short term, it's a 2 to 3 year period.
Yeah.
That, again, these are fixed hard assets. They're hard to get out of quickly. So people will sort of sit tight. I actually had the perspective with, you know, we've had rising house prices in the single family market in the area for, you know, even continuing through this period as interest rates rose. But that would bring more people off the sidelines than it did. Those people but I think it's I can sell my house for X, but what can I buy? What's on the other side of that? So I think until the other side of that equation looks a little bit more appealing, I think you're gonna have people continue to stay put.
Yeah, and that fundamentally means more supply on the market. So Pioneer wrote a paper, published a paper this spring called Supply Stagnation, the root cause of Greater Boston's housing crisis and how to fix it. We identified 4 main factors that have made it especially difficult for home builders to meet demand. Those are restrictive zoning laws, local opposition to development, rising construction costs, and rising financing costs. Gary, what relative weight or emphasis would you give to each of these factors in explaining Boston's tight housing supply in the long run? Or are there additional factors?
I think it's primarily sort of the first two. I think the financial factors we can work around as, you know, as competent financial developers, like those are things we deal with all the time. I think it's the lack of adequate zoning combined with either local political or consumer pushback, resident pushback, butter pushback. Those are things we can't overcome. If we can have all the meetings in the world with the butters, but if we don't have political support to change zoning to allow us to build housing, we can't get anywhere. And it is incredibly easy and cost efficient to block development and to string the process out for an extended period of time to kill it. And I think that is something that has been historically thing in honestly most blue states. I think this is a blue state, red state problem. And in most blue states, we have significant amount of regulation that that is with the best of intentions behind the regulations, but people are using it for their own personal gain in terms of stopping housing. I don't think you could meet a person in Massachusetts who wouldn't tell you we have a housing crisis. I don't know who wants housing built next to them. Every single person we try to talk to says no. But the housing should be built, sure, it's not here.
Right.
And we go town to town and we have this conversation, and no town seems to really want housing. And even the towns that are open to it, they're open to it in a small, okay, we want you to do something, and then we want no more housing. That's it. It's very incremental in the places where we can build.
Yeah. So let me take those issues one at a time, right? Zoning and also local opposition to development. So I want to drill down on the specifics of zoning because to most people, it feels very kind of arcane and multifaceted. So within zoning, there are laws that specify minimum lot sizes, you know, parking requirements in new development, you know, height restrictions, what types of housing you can build, and which you can't. Which of those sorts of rules are most cost prohibitive to a builder like Greystar?
For us, we're a builder of housing at scale. We typically like to build hundreds of units at a time. So for us, it ends up typically being height, density. So FAR, height are the two things that will kill things for us.
And just for the folks at home, FAR,
Is floor area ratio, which essentially says it's lot coverage. It's how much density can I put on a what, if I have an acre of land and there's an FAR of 2, I can build 86,000 square feet on that land.
right? Okay, that's good to know. And so the other side of the equation, when you're going into a review process at a local level where there are gonna be, neighbors who have an opportunity to essentially shut down the project, how do you decide when to take the risk of going through that review process for a project that might not be approved and when not to pursue that?
I think different developers have different approaches. Our approach is incredibly open. I tell all the people who work for me, go talk to the neighbors early on.
Yeah.
And real estate development is large scale financial deals happening at people's kitchen table. I think you need to sit with neighbors and you need to understand what their concerns are. And are they rational concerns or irrational concerns? And if they're rational, like we have a responsibility as a future neighbor to address those in whatever way we can. And if they're irrational, we try to shine a light on, there's nothing that we or anyone can do about that. If someone's concerned that, I attended a meeting once, it wasn't a project of mine, but when I lived inside Boston, I went to a butter meeting and one of the concerns from some neighbors were, well, I don't really want people to be sitting on their decks at night. It's like, well, that's a little bit of an irrational concern. Like they have a deck, they have real estate, they should be able to sit outside. It's from, no, I want them to be mandated that they shouldn't be able to sit outside. And it's, again, I think that we run into more roadblocks with the irrational concerns and people trying to mitigate against one particular case than people's legitimate concerns. Legitimate concerns, typically, we find a way to work with. Someone's concerned about noise or construction debris and through that process or shadow. And again, sometimes we will go and we'll do a shadow study and sometimes maybe in shadow and we may redesign the building, so that's not the case. But if people want to talk to us, I think where we get stuck a little bit now and conversations as well. We're concerned about adding students to the schools. Like, okay, well, this building's gonna pay real estate taxes. Those real estate taxes fund the schools. Like that's a proportion is the amount of real estate taxes that every real property here in the town pays wrong? I don't know. But it's not a developer's job to solve every issue within a town. And we get dragged into things that, well, then there's gonna be more traffic. So we'll need more traffic lights and who's gonna repave all these roads? Because there's gonna be more cars and who's gonna pay for the new teachers that we need for this school? And so, again, that's what the real estate taxes are for. That's been a system of, it's a use tax. We're a use that is gonna use some of those services, not all of them. And we also try to look at, rental housing has, again, typical housing that we build is in either an empty nest or downsizing or young people coming out of college moving up. It's never been a long-term home. We don't build a lot of 3-bedroom apartments. And so we don't have a lot of families.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good because I was gonna ask you kind of both in terms of typology and location. How you take kind of shifting demographics into account when, you propose projects. Because right now, we have a housing stock, especially in the suburbs, that was largely built for, sizable families with kids. But traditional nuclear families make up a much lower share of the total number of households in Massachusetts than they did when most of those homes were built. So you mentioned empty nesters and young professionals. How does those demographic trends kind of factor into your investment decisions in terms of both where you build and what you build?
We have different products for different things. So we have an age restricted product where it's, you have to be 55 years and older to live there. Typically, the average age of a resident in that property is mid-70s. So, we will work with the municipality to age restrict that. And that's something we've tried to be successful with in some towns of, this will definitely not be a burden on your schools. I think where we get stuck on that one, what we're trying to explain to some of the towns is, well, this will actually be helpful. This will allow some of your residents who are living in 4-bedroom homes in this town because their kids and their grandchildren live in this town to give them an opportunity to move to a smaller apartment, free that up for a family. That argument sometimes seems to be lost. So that is definitely that. On the sort of the younger demographic, what we're really seeing is, as Boston became a major international city sort of post 2010, it was very non-institutional in its residential ownership. It was a lot of mom and pop ownerships, and now you have a lot of institutional owners. We're really seeing that, people no longer want to have roommates. And this is also probably a post-COVID thing too. People feel that independence. A lot of college dorms for juniors and seniors now are becoming singles. People want to live on their own. When they move into a rental situation, we're seeing less people want to live in 2 and 3 bedroom apartments with roommates, and they want to be able to get sort of studios and 1 beds. So as we develop around sort of economic cores, you'll see our buildings heavily weighted to studios and 1 beds, because that's sort of serving the need of that demographic.
Yeah, so you touched upon student housing, and I think that's a particular specialty for Greystar, so I want to mention that. So you've personally led development projects that have created housing for thousands of
Mhm.
students. And it seems like Boston would be a good market for student housing on the surface. But in practice, I think we rarely see kind of off-campus, new student housing built by private builders here. In a way that could free up, for example, triple deckers and other small apartment buildings for working families. So can you talk a little bit about why that is and what it would take to kind of alleviate that problem at scale?
Yeah, student housing is not an allowed use within the Boston zoning code. And so right now, student housing within the zoning code, the housing has to be owned and operated, well, at least owned by a university. I think it can be operated by a third party. And why this is important is because if I go and build a building and I want to operate it purely as student housing, I could be claimed to be discriminating against others who are not students. And I don't have, as a private landlord, I don't have the ability to discriminate. And so what that leads to is then you can't have a building that's purely for students. You just have another multifamily building that's maybe tailored to student use. And I don't think that meets the needs of students. I don't think that's what people, investors who want to invest in that space want to invest in. So we really would love to see a private student housing, use within the different buses. But I don't think it's a big change. I think it's going into the definitions and just adjusting that, but it doesn't have to be university.
And you think there's an opportunity to do that in the coming years because Mayor Wu has said he wants to overhaul Boston zoning code?
I hope so. It's been something I've talked with this administration and prior administrations about, and I do think there's an understanding of what we want to do. There does seem to be that it's a lower priority issue. Right. Is what we sort of run into, and people feel, because again, no neighborhood seems to want student housing either. Because there's a negative connotation to what that is. These are also the same neighborhoods where all the existing housing stock has been overrun by students who are renting it. Right. And so you are losing two family, 3 family homes to students where they really should be living in a different use type. And that stock of housing should be much more open to people who work at the city and city services and teachers and police officers and firefighters, but traditionally would have lived in these homes over the last 50 years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of the issue. So Greystar also is known for being on the cutting edge of modular construction, right? It's the idea that instead of building, homes in the traditional way where it's, almost entirely on site, very tailored to a specific project, you have as much of the physical construction off-site, shielded from the elements in a factory as possible. And so I'm really curious about both the opportunities that come with modular construction and the challenges. Have you run into concerns from building inspectors and local officials or what have you?
We definitely run, I'll start at the end, I'll work back. We definitely run into concerns with building inspectors. I think that anytime something is new and not the way we've done things before, people always have concerns. Those concerns have been pretty easily to alleviate. I think, most cities have offsite testing and things of that nature, and we're able to bring inspectors to our factory or have able to hire third-party inspectors who can act on behalf of the city to go out and actually inspect and test. So we to date, we've always been able to sort of work through that. There is an initial concern, and then I think once people understand how it works, we sort of get through that. I think that the 2 biggest issues, that we sort of worked through on modular, and what we see the use case is that we do think we can build faster, potentially for less. That still hasn't been proven. So Greystar, we opened our modular factory in Knox, Pennsylvania. We built it. We bought an existing modular factory, retrofitted it for our use. and it's been in operation for sort of a little over 2 years. And we're noticing our efficiency, and I sort of mentioned just before we jump on the call, that our efficiency has been ramping up from, generating 1 module a week to 5 modules a day, and we still think that efficient, there's a long way to go in increasing that efficiency. So, at maximum production, we do believe we can drive costs down and speed of production up, and speed of production and delivery of housing. I think the other side of that equation is we need demand for all these things, or else there's no reason to build them. And so in the Northeast in particular, we're focused on finding sites to roll this product out. Where other modular companies have failed in the past is they didn't control the demand. And you really don't get to the efficiencies of scale unless you're producing constantly over time. And so if we're controlling demand, there are projects, we're buying the land, we have the foresight to see ahead, and we can basically, the goal is to buy more sites than we can produce for, so that we always have site to build. But that is not without its risk. It's a lot of investment on our part, and it's part of a larger strategy to deliver essential housing and workforce housing that Greystar is undergoing right now. But it's not without its risks.
Right. Yeah, so I think, that's a potentially great solution for building housing, at scale, if some of the issues you mentioned are hammered out. But I also think that recent policy reforms in Massachusetts have focused on kind of more incremental reforms that are kind of maybe, on a kind of local neighborhood level, might be less disruptive for people. I know it's not really the scale that Greystar operates at, but I wanted to ask, since last month, the state legislature legalized accessory dwelling units everywhere in the state. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are small rental units that you can build in the same property as a single family home. Often they're in, detached backyard cottages or above garages or in basements. So I know you don't build housing at Greystar 1 or 2 units at a time, but because you have such a strong background in housing finance, what else will it take to build these units at scale, meaning, in many places at once? Does the average homeowner have sufficient financing options to actually build?
I don't know if they've got the financing options. Do they have the technical capability to do it and do it correctly? I think it's probably a bigger concern. And obviously it's not an area where Greystar is going to focus. And it's something where I have still a lot of questions. Or like, what are we trying to achieve? And are we trying to help multi-generational families live under the same roof? Is that ultimately the goal? I don't really see that if I go and build a small 1-bedroom cottage in my large backyard, who's going to live in it? Who's that appealing to? What housing needs is that solving? I think, are we talking about taking, brownstones in the city of Boston and being able to turn them into condos with more ease? I see how that works. That could definitely generate more housing. And just, I've said this before, it's just not enough. That's not going to move the needle. That you sort of said it is marginal. I think we're so far behind that we really need to think much bigger and much bigger scale than the policy of this can imply. I think it's going to be some things to some people. It's not going to be everything to everyone, and I don't really think it's going to move the needle over time that potentially some politicians do.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you said that. So, maybe we should shift gears then to talking about an example of where we have seen on a regional level more of that large scale development. I know that Greystar has done a lot of work in Everett, Massachusetts. Everett has this old kind of industrial district, which is basically the entire southern third or so of the city, which has, and especially between, I think it's Route 16 and the rail line, is the commercial triangle, which is known for having been transformed in recent years with new apartment blocks and retail options. It just strikes me as a great way of not only adding new housing in a relatively kind of politically palatable way. This was, an industrial wasteland before, but also from the city's perspective, you're getting, at scale, kind of cleanup of environmental contamination issues and an immense expansion of the tax base and with new infrastructure. So I guess my question would be, what makes this sort of large scale transformation possible in Everett, both politically and technically? And would a similar approach work in other industrial and office parks region-wide?
100% yes.
Okay.
So it's really two things. You sort of said it's politically and technically. politically, you're taking something where no one currently lived. These were not only scrap yards, eyesore burdens to the community. And you're saying, okay, I'm going to allow housing, I'm going to allow large scale development through here. And again, at a scale that's large enough to create community. And so then technically that's done by just zoning. Like they just rezoned the whole area. Were very progressive about it, thought about it in a very straightforward manner. Didn't try to enact a lot of policy through zoning. Said we would like to see housing or office or hotel. Very broad, allowed you to build to certain heights, solid density. I think it was very unusual for the greater Boston and Massachusetts area to see something like this. And now we're building a little over 2,000 apartments there in 5 different buildings. And over the course of the last 3 years. So if given the opportunity, we can build, and companies like ourselves can build a lot of housing quickly, but we have to be given the opportunity. So I think when you talk about other times, I think that cities and municipalities, I'm gonna tie this together a little with the NBA to Communities Act. What worked here was we're taking somewhere where people didn't live and there's no abutters. So there's really no one should have an issue with improving this area. I think one of the failures of the MBTA Communities Act is, radiuses around the train stations, and then it was sort of forcing housing. I think that conversation might have went a little bit better if it was just like, okay, these times you need to create housing somewhere. And maybe we'll give you much more flexibility on where that is. And really, again, create a problem that needed to be solved and let municipalities solve it a little more independently. Whereas, I think people gamed that system a little bit, and now we've got 2-story buildings being rezoned to be 3-story buildings. No one's gonna tear that building down and no one's gonna go and build on top of it. Or I don't think any developer wants to go in and transform a town's main street. Your main street's your main street. It always has been that way. People have lived there for generations. They love that. Trying to force density into places where it's not wanted is definitely different than putting density where it should be. And I think that's what the city of Everett did. They put density where it could and should be that didn't impact anybody else. And then it happened. And I think that's a really great roadmap for where a lot of other towns should go. But then you get to the point of, do they want to go there? And I think that's a bigger issue than what people should do, is what they want to do.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So for context, Gary is touching on implementation of the MBTA Communities Act, which is a 2021 law that mandates that about half the state's municipalities, mostly in eastern and central Mass, need to zone at least one multifamily district where housing up to 15 units an acre is allowed by right. And kind of, in the implementation process, we've seen a lot of communities kind of rezone older areas so that in practice you can't add much new housing capacity, or there would be other complicated issues with redeveloping kind of existing kind of granular areas with many different owners. So you touched upon kind of how impactful the law might be in communities that have taken that approach. I think other communities have gone more above and beyond in implementing that, and Everett might be one of them. Do you envision Greystar capitalizing on the MBTA Communities Act anywhere, or if you can tell me, have they already done so?
We have a couple of different sites that we are in loose contractual agreements based on the outcome of all of these different zoning analysis, where we will hopefully build housing. I just, knowing, Greystar has a handful of these sites, there's some other competitors of our size, have a few of these sites, so maybe this creates a wave of initial housing through, but it's still not the perpetual new supply that we need to solve our problem. I think it will help generate some housing in the same way that, 30 years ago, 40B did. And it's a wave of housing. I think we need to get to the point where those waves are coming very periodically and not every 25 to 30 years.
Yeah.
So there will be housing built out of this, definitely. It's not going to be at the scale that I think the Baker administration wanted. But more is still better than less. I just think there's more work to be done.
Yeah, and frankly, I do think Chapter 40B was better at creating kind of an evergreen kind of development scenario, because the kind of 10% of your community threshold you need in terms of affordable housing.
Well, 40B is 25%.
Right, in a project, but on the town-wide
Okay,
basis.
sorry, yeah.
In order to get to the threshold to be kind of, to reach, safe harbor and not be subject to potential developments. that's a moving target, because assuming you're adding market rate housing as well in your community, you know, all of a sudden, the number of units you need that are deed restricted as affordable kind of goes up over time.
Think Towns have gotten very good at working ways to block 40B development.
Yes, I agree. Before, you know, the development team kind of stares me down here. I should mention that the Pioneer is a new paper coming out in a couple of weeks on the MBTA Communities Act. And so we'll have plenty of case studies on implementation and also recommendations on the state's enforcement approach. I think the other aspect of the MBTA Communities Act, worth mentioning actually, is that it gets to the heart of the tension between kind of local control over planning and zoning in Massachusetts, which has been kind of the existing paradigm for, you know, almost 100 years now. And on the other hand, kind of accountability to regional housing needs. And so I wanted to ask, do cities and towns have the right kind of incentives to proactively work on this problem themselves? Or if not, how do we make sure that regional housing, you know, solutions and policies respect the local context around individual projects?
I don't think they've got the right incentives because we're not seeing housing produced the way that we think that it should be. So I don't think the right incentives exist. I think that it's tough for, and we're talking about municipalities across the state that vary in size, that vary in the, you know, do they have a full-time professional planning service? Do they have constituents who are volunteering their time? So there's a wide range of time and availability and skill set there. And I think what's happening now is that people's worries are being brought to the forefront. Their concerns about schools, their concerns about traffic, other things. And a lot of municipalities don't have the resources to examine that in a holistic way and really think about it. And so we have had conversations at different times where we're trying to bring in a consultant who can help them think about what this will mean for a number of kids who are going to be in their schools over the coming years. But then it's coming from us, they don't trust us. So there's a natural trust imbalance there. And I think the state, this could be a place where the state can really help by creating frameworks and creating research, and even groups like, you know, the Pioneer Institute, you're writing papers on like, what does 300 new units of multifamily housing for a certain type mean over the course of 10, 15, 20 years to a school system? What does that actually mean? That data is there and can be somewhat tracked. Someone just needs to pull it all together so we can take some of those concerns off the table and help move some of these projects forward. You know, people are overly concerned right now about traffic, and traffic is definitely bad. But at the same time, I'm also being told that I need to have 100% electrification of the garage because everyone's going to go to EVs. Some cities are saying, we don't want you to build any parking because at some point there's going to be no cars because it's all going to be driverless cars. Others are saying, no, you need to build more parking. There's not, we're being forced to respond to individual concerns and not what I think are rational concerns of like, what are the trends? What does the research say? And I think the state could be helpful by sort of laying out, this is what we see. And then particularly as it relates to housing, we have a housing crisis. If we want to build more housing, we need to identify all the points of concern. And then I think the state is the ultimate sort of person who can step in and be like, okay, we understand this concern, but this is how a town and municipality should look and think about it. So that we're not being led by individual, you know, policymakers within municipalities who may be skewed one way or another without, you know, any research to back it up.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think, you know, the green building piece of it is something that I've personally not delved into. But I will say on the kind of school capacity piece, we already have research from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council dating back to, I think, 2017, that shows that there's at best a very weak relationship between adding to the housing stock and, you know, kind of expanding school enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with multifamily housing, like the larger the apartment building you have, the fewer school children per unit on average are living there. You know, a lot of people assume, you know, what have you, 50 condos means, you know, 50 school kids.
Maybe 100 is the argument that I've heard.
Yeah, but I think the data point I've seen, and this is particular to Massachusetts, it might be a few years out of date, but among large apartment buildings that are more than 100 units, on average, there is one school child for every 10 units, which is astounding to me. But I think,
you know, the city of Newton this is an interesting one that I saw over the last 6 or 9 months, that You know, that was a time where a lot of people had pushed back on multifamily development as a whole. One of the concerns was students in school, and now I think it was a policy came out that the Duke was gonna start taking children from other adjacent municipalities because they didn't have enough students to fill their schools.
Yeah.
So I do think there needs to be a real conversation around what that math is, how it works.
Yeah.
And are we using things as policy blockers for point of just being NIMBY or a YIMBY? Like where are we on that scale?
Right. It is 70+% of Greater Boston traditional public school districts that have seen declining enrollment in the last 10 years. And I think that's a point that rarely comes up when it's, you know, the neighbors versus the developer.
Yeah.
On school capacity issues. I do want to talk a little bit more about potential opportunities for additional supply and affordability. And one thing that strikes me as a good opportunity coming out of COVID is there's a lot less demand for office space than there has been previously, especially in Boston, right? You know, early months of the pandemic, people were sounding the death knell of Boston's kind of decade-long housing market boom. But now, you know, we have residential vacancy rates that are lower than they were before COVID, and office vacancy rates that are, you know, in some classes 20% or more. So, you know, Mayor Wu has had a office to residential conversion program piloted downtown, and I'm wondering, you know. And the way that works is it's property tax abatement is the incentive there, which affects, you know, operating costs more than the upfront construction costs. Would there be a way to make more of these office to residential conversion projects work if there were more, you know, upfront cost reductions or a way to subsidize or incentivize that? And in general, should the office conversion program be extended beyond downtown, or what would it take to make more of these conversions possible is the bottom line of the question.
It's incredibly difficult thing to accomplish. We're really seeing that the risk for it is return. So I think what the current incentive program really incented was those who already owned office buildings and had very low occupancy. It provided maybe an off-ramp for that ownership or investment. Okay, well, we're gonna take this thing we already own, and this is potentially a solution to our problem. And I think a lot of the people who were lobbying the city and talking with the city and providing stakeholder input, that was the seat they were in. They were looking at it from like, well, I own this building, it's 20% vacant, or 20% occupied, 80% vacant. What, I need your help to like change this. So we haven't seen a large, usage in this program. And I think it's because it doesn't really attract new capital, it doesn't attract new people into the market. It's really potentially gonna help those who already own buildings. We've looked at, some office buildings have traded and come to the market. Your older 50, 60-year-old buildings, even buildings of this size, the footprint maybe makes some more sense to be converted into housing. I think a lot of people can get their heads around how that could sort of work. You start looking at your more traditional Class A, Class B, large office buildings. Nothing in there really works for residential. They are two very different animals. And it's gonna cost roughly the same as building a new building with more risk. And so that's ultimately the problem. So the incentives need to be even more to get people over that hurdle. And so I'll give you a good example. If we office at 1 Federal Street across from here, if 1 Federal Street came on the market and, it's like 1 million square feet and we wanted to convert that into residential, I would have to spend millions of dollars to figure out if that's feasible. I'm not gonna do that to figure out if it's feasible. I sort of need to know up front, and that's the issue right now, is it's costing too much to figure out if it's feasible for anyone to take the risk to find out if it's feasible. So people are just staying away from it.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I also want to mention, as we kind of come to the end of our 1v1 talk here, we'll take questions from the audience in a bit. Pioneer's done a lot of work looking at out-migration trends from Massachusetts in the past few years. My colleague Aidan Enright has a paper coming out using IRS data that kind of breaks down, who is leaving Massachusetts and what the consequences of that are. We expect that to be released sometime in October. Housing prices are a big factor driving people away from Massachusetts, and particularly Greater Boston. Gary, you've written op-eds and done a lot of work on how to overcome community opposition to development.
Mhm.
Does this broader economic argument of people are leaving, it's hurting our economy, our workforce, would rather live in North Carolina, does that broader economic argument resonate with people?
Not that I've seen today. I think it's unfortunate, but no, I think people, people will hear you, they will agree with you, and then they will think, oh, I should still do something else. And I think that, as long as we, again, I think a great thing about Boston, Massachusetts in general is we really empowered people. And, again, if you remember, the zoning was always intended to protect the rights of the landowner. And we pushed that down. We allowed people to be involved in the process, people to be involved in discussions that happen in their neighborhood. I also think that happened at a time when we had urban planning that supported the population growth and densities that we needed. And so today we don't. And now we're trying to make those changes with 50 to 100 years of context of how the neighborhood has looked and felt for that period of time. And people are looking to what they're comfortable with as just that it's what they knew and what they know. And that argument is just not moving them off their position.
Right.
I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I appreciate the candidness there. So I'd say that at a broader level, these migration trends suggest that, we do have a national affordability problem, especially with housing, but Greater Boston is, struggling more so in that realm than other areas. So I wanted to ask, what other major metropolitan areas, across the country are getting it right or more right than we are? And if so, what policies are there should we adopt to better emulate those efforts?
There's two aspects to this. There's the investor in me. So as an investor, we purely as an investor, we love restrictions. We love that you can't build new supply. You own some housing, your rents will continue to go up every year, even as your expenses go up, but you're protected. That investment is protected. As a developer, we hate those regulations because you can't build new supply. And so where we have seen the market function normally under rational conditions are, and this is not intended to be a political statement, but it's in a lot of red markets with less regulation. And we're seeing a lot more growth. You look at the Southeast markets. Right now in Nashville, you can go and rent an apartment and you'll get 3 or 4 months rent free in your first year of your lease. That is economics at play. That's what that is. But a lot of capital moved to invest in Nashville over the course of the last 4 years. Again, you can find a piece of land, you can build a multifamily building, you can build a hotel, you can build all the things you want. And then when that supply dynamic balance flips, you get punished for it. But that's the risk of our capitalist economy, and that's what people take risk for. I think if we deregulated some of our anti-housing laws, we could see a lot more housing production. But I do think that culturally goes against how the Northeast has been for the last 100+ years. And I think that's something that people are going to struggle with. But if, and I've compared this in the past, if you think when the Kennedy administration said we're going to the moon, like there's the moonshot program, we're going to go do this. I think you need a similar approach with housing. Like we no longer take a marginal approach. We need to take a very different approach. And that is going to be culturally very uncomfortable. Also politically very unpalatable. So I don't know who's going to lead that effort, because no one who wants to be reelected wants to tell everyone who needs to elect them that, I'm sorry, we're not going to listen to you.
Yeah, marriage of economics and culture. That's what it comes down to. Gary, I could ask you questions all day, but I think it's time to take some questions from the audience.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So for our viewers online, you're welcome to unmute and ask a question via Zoom. You can also send one in the chat as well.
Well, I'll ask one. You mentioned, I think you used the term ADI. I don't remember the A, ADU, dwelling units. What is it? What's the A stand for?
It's accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, can you explain a little bit? I mean, for example, if there's a if there's a house lot in a suburban community, which accommodates one house, but maybe could have another one if the zoning regulations were modified so that the the street footage and maybe the acreage is scaled down a little bit, you could get another dwelling unit in there. The town, of course, is going to object because they have the zoning regulations there, so it doesn't go anywhere. And this isn't solving the housing problem in any global sense, but given this ADU law or regulation, is it possible for the town to be overruled in its zoning restrictions and a unit to be put in a lot like that?
So that's a great question, and the answer is yes, and in fact, it's essentially already happened. So under the housing bond bill that passed the state legislature last month, there's a policy provision that says, you know, if you're a municipal government, you can't prevent homeowners in single-family districts from building an ADU up to 900 square feet on their lot, as long as it meets certain dimensional requirements. I think the lot size might have to be at least 10,000 square feet, which is about a quarter of an acre. And there are a couple of other provisions. But I think what we saw with ADUs is there were dozens of towns that legalized them over the last couple of decades. And then, you know, there was kind of the push at the state level to kind of, you know, standardize some of those conditions around them and regulations around them at the state level, because it could be, I think, a much more salient solution than it has been at the town level, when the towns have owner occupancy requirements and parking requirements and what have you. But yes, you know, in most cases, in a single family lot in Massachusetts, it is legal to build an accessory dwelling unit right now, even if your town, you know, building inspector or planning department doesn't like it.
But if you live in a town and you want to get this done, and the planning department says no, what do you do to move it forward?
Well, it is legal now. So my understanding is, you know, the planning department's been overruled by the state already. That said, I'm sure that there are, you know, conditions hard to do in practice with
Do
fire
you just
code.
call a builder? Do you just say, I attended the Pioneer seminar on this, so I'm going to call the builder, and he goes in there, and you don't even need to buy your leave from the neighbors or the zoning board, and
Right, well, you're gonna have to, you know, file a building permit application and go through the process that I'm sure your town staff can help you out with. But, I guess I'm not.
they won't
quite understanding
want
what
to because, they're opposed to it, but they have to do it, is what you're saying.
Yes, it is the law.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right.
Yes.
Have you looked at other countries and how they handle the housing for their citizens? And what works and doesn't work when you're talking about building at a massive scale for an increasing population? I was in Singapore for the last whatever, so I'm curious.
We're global. We have offices all around the world. You know, some of our larger markets are in mainland Europe and the UK. And we're just seeing a lot more acceptance of building taller buildings there than we maybe do in the US. I think in the US, people get overly conscious of height for some reason. So we're seeing a lot more density in sort of the urban centers. And then I think outside of that, you know, and I'm from Ireland myself, so I grew up with a lot of this. We're just seeing that government understands that we need more housing.
Right.
And so they're taking land that just even they call it the green belt. These are areas you couldn't build in, and they're now saying you can go build in them.
Right.
And so it is being a lot more government led than it is here. I think here we're still, and again, I'll take areas like Massachusetts, we're still being very focused on marginal policies, and then the scale is coming from developers who are trying to push things forward. And it's just so much more difficult for us to push those forward in terms of dollars and time and resources. So, but I do think it's government led.
Right.
Yeah.
Evaluate what I do.
Yeah.
On that subject, the Healy administration is putting together a sort of a kind of a next set of housing policy proposals. What's your short list for something that you'd want to have on there.
I think we need to start looking to what New York has done in terms of tax abatement.
Mhm.
And really helping to think about how we can incentivize development. Development has reached a point where in a lot of places it's financially infeasible and may remain so for a long period of time. And I think, at least in the short term, we need to start thinking about what are the incentives, financial incentives that we can, again, if we have a need and there's something we as a society believe we need. I think government should be trying to incent that or make that as easy as possible. You know, other things that I personally have talked to people and I'd love to see is maybe going back and looking at 40B and seeing, does it make sense in today's world? And is there changes or tweaks to that program that can be made to make it really go back to its original onus and achieve the housing production that we'd like to see? I think, you know, the MBTA Communities Act started outlining affordability between 10% and 20%. And that saw a lot more sites become viable. You know, 40B is still at 25%. I think we're sort of, that's just not financially feasible anymore to be able to do that. So maybe there's a tweak in the affordable policy there. I don't think that's on the agenda. Something I think that should be on the agenda.
Can I also say on 40B, so the way the state categorizes units that are on the subsidized housing inventory, which is kind of the measuring stick for whether you're meeting the threshold under 40B or not, it often puts rent, especially in rental properties, units that are market rate, if they're in kind of a mixed income arrangement, in the subsidized housing inventory as well. So hypothetically, you could reform that so that it's only the deed restricted units that count.
Mhm.
And therefore, that would increase, in practice, the capacity for 40B development in a lot of communities, you know, by potentially thousands of units. And I think that what's more, that's a reform that, because it's not in the statute itself, it's not in 40B itself, the UHLC could just decide to do that if they wanted to. I think, you know, please confirm that with Chris Clutchman or someone else, state official. But I think that's a potentially promising area for reform if there is the political will for that at the highest reaches of government.
And I guess kind of also too, you know, we talked about the local angle and the state angle. On the federal level, you know, it is election season, and you know, the Harris campaign has kind of come out with this goal of adding 3 million in inventory. Obviously, it's not necessarily detail filled, but I guess having that federal kind of input and kind of federal wanting to add inventory, does that have an effect, especially in a place like Massachusetts with these local restrictions, or is it just kind of, I guess, well wishing?
I think housing is a local issue. I think once the federal government gets involved, it goes sideways. I think leaving these things to the states is where the problem will get fixed and resolved. I don't think the federal government can effectuate housing. We have a legal system that really puts all the power closest to the people. And the federal government doesn't have the ability to make the changes, unless they want to take, again, Air Force bases and, you know, things like that and say, okay, we're gonna turn federal resources and we're gonna hand it over for housing. Other than that, I don't really see what they can do.
It's easy for them to goose the demand side, but it's hard for them to increase the supply. All the permitting is local.
You said earlier that the restriction is because of the way things have been done for 100 years, and there's sort of the local established outlook as to what the neighborhood's like and who should have say in what. If you could wave a magic wand within the bounds of rationality, and setting aside for a moment the cultural inertia of a century of doing it a certain way, what do you think the zoning rules should be? If you were, you know, imagine starting a new community and you were going to put some kind of reasonable boundaries on making the neighborhood functional and enjoyable, and yet really open it up for the possibility of building.
So I think that if I could wave my magic wand, I think housing, again, I do think a roof over your head is probably a universal right at this point. And I think housing should be an allowed zoning class everywhere with caveats around what you can build. But I don't think that there should be anywhere that a person wants to build a home, they shouldn't really be allowed to build a home. And so I think we should be looking at, again, there should be setbacks, there should be density requirements, again, certain lot size coverages. but I think housing should be as of right across the state. Unless there's some, you know, environmental issue or something like that, that it shouldn't be there, it would be caustic to do it. I do think that if there's a piece of land and it was a warehouse and now you want to tear down the warehouse and build housing, why not? You should be allowed to do so. And I think that should be established in terms of like the density based on the site area is already set, the use types, the, you know, what the requirements that go with it. I think all those things should have been set up front. And housing is something we should build.
But isn't it, as soon as you put in setbacks and lot size, don't you open the door for the zoning board to be able to restrict? Because they can just make, well, the lot size has to be large and the frontage has to be long, and all of a sudden you don't have the housing opportunity for building that maybe the area could sustain, but the politics won't.
I think you can look at, again, this would never happen, but you could look at what are the precedents within the area in which you're building. You know, do homes generally sit on lots that have 10-foot setbacks? Okay, you can't say that any new lot now needs to be 20 feet. It really needs to be within the context of what has been, you know, in that municipality before. And then I think when you start thinking about larger scale developments, the things that we build, I think there's pretty good context across the state over what they should and should not be. And there's certain setbacks in terms of shadow and other things that that are reasonable. And I think that everyone could agree is fair and rational.
So are we looking about, we seem to look a lot into the past, the rearview mirror. Are we looking, and I'm a newbie here, are we looking at how we want the 22nd century to look? How we want to incorporate green? How we want to, you talk about density, how we want to increase density if we're gonna have more people, and how we want to create a livable quality environment for the next generation and generations to come. And is that thought process taking place as we have these discussions with our legislators and our government officials?
Can I take that one?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, this holistic thinking can be part of kind of a comprehensive planning process, which is often led by cities and towns. Some are, you know, more proactive than others at that, and especially more proactive at implementing them. But I think when it comes to, you know, allowing enough of an opportunity for private builders to help solve our housing crisis, you know, there's a distinction to be made between, you know, you can have kind of a guided discussion about what the regulations should be in advance. But what a lot of cities and towns do is they have kind of process-based requirements that make it easy to rehash all those issues for every single project. And I think that's where you get a lot of the opportunities for community opposition and delays that ultimately shut a project down. So I do think there's absolutely room for, you know, planning out green space, planning out communities in a comprehensive way in advance. But, you know, that has to make an allowance for projects that, you know, in and of themselves can go through kind of purely administrative review rather than kind of, you need a special permit, you need to talk to this board and this committee and get their permission for all sorts of design and related aspects. Does that answer your question?
I'd find out to that I do think that a lot of cities and the state and the major cities like Boston, they do have very forward-looking lens. And we have seen that in terms of some environmental policy and other things of that nature. I think what happens is one aspect of future looking overrides everything else. So it's like, we want this level of energy efficiency because that's where the world is going. We have climate change. And I think what we have failed to do is sort of weigh these things against each other and say, we really want to be, you know, here on energy, but we won't get there for 25 years. So let's not be overly aggressive on this one policy because we also want to build 100,000 units of housing a year. How do we do both those things together? And the problem that I've seen there is that we have a failure between private and public to build trust. And so as a private developer or someone who works in finance, a lot of municipalities, I don't believe, if I say I can't build housing with this new energy policy, they don't believe. And there's lobbying that goes up for, and there's back and forth. And I think ultimately what that leads to is not the best policy that gets created. We have the best goal, but the policy to get that goal is not always the one that works to achieve a broader goal. So it's like, great, we're gonna achieve this in energy over a time frame. Hey, we're still not gonna build any housing, so we didn't solve that goal. We just made building housing more difficult. Yeah.
Well, Andrew, Gary, thank you so much for this really dynamic and great conversation. I know I certainly learned a lot, and are excited to see what's coming next. So, thank you for that. For our guests today, I just want to make sure that you're aware of some of our upcoming events that we have over the next couple of months. John's pulling it up on the screen here to share with us all. But our next event is going to be on Wednesday, October 9th. We'll be looking at the very contentious and important conversation about the MCAS and the future of that test with the upcoming ballot initiative. So hope you'll join us for that. That'll be followed up on October 10th. We'll be looking at the end of home equity theft in Massachusetts, that our law center played a really instrumental role in having that law changed. And so I hope that will be one that certainly will be of interest to many people. And then we have two marquee events coming up. First, our inaugural Denison Lecture, which will feature Paul Clement, who will be speaking on the continually timely topic of free speech on college campuses. And on Thursday, November 7th, we will have our annual Peters Lecture, where we will have Harvard economist Roland Fryer, who's speaking on the important role that capitalism can play in driving social mobility. So again, I'd like to thank Andrew and Gary for your comments today, and thanks everyone for joining us.